The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Captain James Mitchell walked slowly toward the ceremonial guard post. His military uniform bore the weight of countless medals, each one telling a story of courage under fire. The Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross caught the light as he moved with the careful steps of a man whose body had been broken and rebuilt by war. It was Memorial Day, and the palace was hosting a special ceremony to honor fallen soldiers. Captain Mitchell had been invited as the guest of honor, representing the thousands of veterans who had served their country with distinction. But as he approached the ornate gates, his attention was drawn to something that made him stop in his tracks. Standing perfectly still at the palace entrance was a royal guard in full ceremonial dress. The young man could not have been more than 25 years old, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to stare straight ahead without blinking. His red uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease razor sharp. He held his position with the kind of discipline that only comes from months of rigorous training. What struck Captain Mitchell most deeply was not the guard's appearance, but something in his posture that reminded him of soldiers he had known. In combat, there was a quality of readiness, of quiet strength, that transcended the ceremonial nature of the position. This was not just a young man in fancy clothes playing soldier. This was someone who understood what it meant to serve. The crowd of dignitaries and tourists flowing around the courtyard paid little attention to the guard. To them, he was part of the scenery, as decorative and expected as the palace's ancient stones. They took photos with him in the background, chatted loudly near his post, and treated him as if he were invisible. But Captain Mitchell saw something different. As the ceremony began and speeches were given about sacrifice and honor, Captain Mitchell found his eyes returning again and again to the motionless figure by the gate. The guard had not moved for over an hour, had not shown any sign of discomfort or distraction despite the growing heat and the increasing crowd. There was something almost spiritual about his dedication to duty. During a break in the proceedings, Captain Mitchell made a decision that surprised everyone around him. Instead of joining the other dignitaries for refreshments, he walked directly toward the guard post. His military dress shoes clicked against the stone pavement as he approached, each step deliberate and purposeful. The crowd began to notice his movement. Conversations quieted as people turned to see where the guest of honor was going. Cameras started following his path, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The palace staff looked nervous, unsure whether this deviation from the planned program was appropriate. Captain Mitchell stopped 3 feet in front of the royal guard and looked directly into the young man's eyes. For a moment, the two soldiers studied each other across the divide of age, experience, and circumstance. One was a battle-tested veteran whose service had taken him to the furthest corners of the world. The other was a ceremonial guard whose duty was to stand perfectly still and represent the dignity of an ancient institution. But in that moment, Captain Mitchell saw past the differences to something fundamental that connected them. Both were servants of something greater than themselves. Both had committed their lives to duty, honor, and the protection of others. Both understood the weight of uniform and the responsibility that came with wearing it. Slowly, with the precision that had been drilled into him during decades of military service, Captain Mitchell raised his right hand to his forehead in a crisp, perfect salute. The gesture was not casual or perfunctory. It was the kind of salute that soldiers give to fallen comrades, full of respect and recognition for shared sacrifice. The crowd fell completely silent. The clicking of cameras stopped. Even the children who had been running around the courtyard seemed to sense that something important was happening. In that stillness, Captain Mitchell held his salute, his eyes never leaving the guard's face. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared on social media millions of times, and remembered as one of the most moving displays of military brotherhood ever witnessed. The Royal Guard, who was trained never to break his position, never to acknowledge crowds or distractions, never to move from his post during his watch, began to tremble. At first it was barely noticeable, slight shaking in his hands that held the ceremonial rifle. Then his lips began to quiver, and his carefully controlled breathing became irregular. The young man was fighting an internal battle between his training and his emotions. Between duty and humanity, tears began to form in the corners of his eyes, threatening to spill down his cheeks and betray the composure that was the cornerstone of his role. The crowd watched in fascination and growing emotion as they witnessed this moment of human connection, transcending protocol and tradition. Captain Mitchell continued to hold his salute, understanding instinctively that this moment meant something profound to the young guard. Here was recognition from someone who truly understood what service meant, someone who had earned the right through blood and sacrifice to honor another soldier's dedication. The silence stretched on, filled with unspoken communication between two men who had never met, but who shared the deepest bonds that can exist between human beings, the bond of those who serve others before themselves. The tension in the courtyard was so thick, it seemed to press against everyone present. Captain Mitchell maintained his salute with unwavering precision. While the young Royal Guard fought the most difficult battle of his military career, the battle against his own overwhelming emotions. For Private Thomas Anderson, standing guard at the palace gates was supposed to be the pinnacle of his military service. After 2 years of grueling training, he had been selected from hundreds of candidates to join the elite ceremonial guard unit. His family had been so proud when he received the appointment. His father, a retired sergeant, had tears in his eyes when Thomas first appeared in the distinctive red uniform, but the reality of the position had been lonelier than Thomas had expected. Day after day, he stood motionless while thousands of people passed by, treating him like a statue or a tourist attraction, while children would try to make him laugh. Teenagers would pose for selfies next to him as if he were a prop. Adults would debate whether the guards were real soldiers or just actors hired for show. No one ever acknowledged that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a real person who had sacrificed normal life for service. No one recognized that standing perfectly still for hours required its own form of courage and dedication.
Ow.
No one understood that the decorative rifle he carried represented a commitment to defend others, even if that defense might never be needed until now. Until this scarred veteran with kind eyes and a chest full of medals had seen him, really seen him, and offered the one thing that meant more than anything else. Recognition from a fellow soldier. The tears that Thomas had been fighting, finally, began to roll down his cheeks. His training screamed at him to maintain composure, to remember that hundreds of people were watching, to uphold the dignity of his position. But something deeper than training was responding to Captain Mitchell's gesture in the crowd. People began to understand what they were witnessing. This was not just a photo opportunity or a moment of ceremony. This was one warrior honoring another. The young guard's emotional response revealed the humanity that existed beneath the pageantry. An elderly woman in the crowd began to cry as she watched the scene unfold. Her husband had served in World War II and had often spoken about the brotherhood that existed among soldiers, regardless of when or where they served. She was seeing that brotherhood in action. It brought back memories of her husband's own stories about moments of connection that transcended words. A teenage boy who had been joking with his friends about trying to make the guard laugh suddenly felt ashamed. Watching the tears on Thomas's face, he began to understand that the person in the red uniform was not a toy or entertainment. He was someone's son, someone who had chosen to serve his country in his own way. Captain Mitchell noticed the crowd's reaction in his peripheral vision, but his focus remained entirely on the young guard. He could see the internal struggle playing out on Thomas's face and recognized it from his own experience. There had been moments during his tours of duty when the weight of service, the isolation of command, and the responsibility for others' lives had threatened to overwhelm him. He remembered standing at attention during military funerals, fighting back tears as friends were laid to rest. He remembered the loneliness of leadership, the burden of making decisions that affected other people's lives. He remembered the moments when he had questioned whether his sacrifice was seen or appreciated by the people he served. Looking at this young guard, Captain Mitchell saw all of those struggles reflected back at him. The circumstances were different, but the fundamental challenge was the same: how to serve with dignity when that service often goes unrecognized and unappreciated. After what felt like hours, but was actually only 2 minutes, Captain Mitchell made another decision that surprised everyone. Instead of simply dropping his salute and walking away, he took a step closer to Thomas. The movement caused a ripple of whispers through the crowd, as palace protocol strictly forbade interaction with the ceremonial guards, but Captain Mitchell was beyond concerns about protocol. He was operating on a different level now, responding to something more important than rules and regulations. He was responding to the bond between soldiers, the recognition of shared service, and the understanding that sometimes human connection transcends institutional boundaries. Standing now, just 18 inches from Thomas, Captain Mitchell spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly in the hushed courtyard. "Thank you for your service, soldier. Your dedication honors us all." The words hit Thomas like a physical force. No one had ever thanked him for his service as a royal guard. The position was seen as ceremonial, decorative, not real military service. But here was a man whose own service was unquestionable, whose sacrifice was written in the scars on his hands and the medals on his chest. And he was expressing gratitude for Thomas's dedication. Thomas's composure finally cracked completely. A sob escaped his lips, followed by another. His shoulders began to shake as months of isolation, dedication, and unrecognized service poured out in an emotional flood that he could no longer contain. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the perfect, motionless soldier revealed himself to be intensely human. Some people began to applaud, instinctively understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Others stood quietly, moved by the raw emotion of the moment. Captain Mitchell maintained his position, neither stepping back nor trying to comfort Thomas physically. He understood that this moment belonged to the young guard, that this release was something Thomas needed to experience fully. All he could do was remain present as a witness to the courage it took to serve, even in ways that others might not understand or appreciate. The palace courtyard had become a cathedral of silence, broken only by the soft sounds of Thomas's emotional release. Palace security guards, who had started moving toward the scene when Captain Mitchell first approached, now stood frozen in uncertainty. Their training told them to maintain proper protocol, but their human instincts recognized that interrupting this moment would be wrong. Colonel Margaret Hayes, the palace's military liaison, watched from the ceremonial viewing platform with growing anxiety. She had organized hundreds of state functions and military ceremonies, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this unprecedented situation. The guest of honor was breaking protocol. The ceremonial guard was crying in front of hundreds of witnesses, and the entire carefully orchestrated event was spiraling beyond her control. But as she watched Captain Mitchell's unwavering presence and witnessed Thomas's raw emotion, something shifted in her understanding. This was not a breach of protocol that needed to be stopped. This was perhaps the most genuine moment of military honor she had ever witnessed in the crowd. Phones had come out as people began recording what they instinctively knew was something special. A mother lifted her young daughter onto her shoulders so the child could see better, whispering explanations about bravery and service. An elderly veteran in the crowd slowly raised his own hand in salute, joining Captain Mitchell in honoring the young guard. The moment lasted another full minute before Thomas began to regain his composure. His breathing gradually steadied, and the shaking in his shoulders subsided. But the tears continued to flow freely down his face, and his eyes remained locked on Captain Mitchell's with a mixture of gratitude and amazement that someone had finally seen him. What happened next shocked everyone, even more than Thomas's emotional breakdown. In a movement so subtle that many in the crowd missed it initially, Thomas began to raise his right hand. His ceremonial rifle remained perfectly positioned in his left hand, but his right hand slowly, deliberately moved toward his forehead. The palace guards who noticed the movement held their breath. What Thomas was about to do was absolutely forbidden. Royal guards were never, under any circumstances, supposed to break their ceremonial position to acknowledge individuals in the crowd. The rules were clear and had been drilled into him during months of training, but Thomas was no longer thinking about rules. He was responding to something deeper than protocol, something that connected him to Captain Mitchell in a way that transcended military regulations. This man had seen his service, had honored his dedication, and had reminded him why he wore the uniform in the first place. With the same precision that Captain Mitchell had shown, Thomas raised his hand in a perfect military salute. Was slow, deliberate, and filled with meaning. As his hand reached his forehead, a collective gasp went up from the crowd. Several people began to applaud, but the sound was quickly hushed by others who understood that they were witnessing something sacred. For 30 seconds, the two soldiers held their mutual salute. Age and youth, combat veteran and ceremonial guard, wounded warrior and pristine sentry. All differences dissolved in that gesture of mutual respect and recognition. Colonel Hayes felt tears forming in her own eyes as she watched the exchange. In 20 years of military service, she had seen many displays of courage and honor, rarely anything as pure as this moment of connection between two soldiers, who had never met but who understood each other completely. The crowd around the courtyard had grown as word spread that something extraordinary was happening at the palace gates. Tourists who had been exploring other parts of the grounds hurried over to see what was causing such a stir. Local news crews, initially there to cover the Memorial Day ceremony, began focusing their cameras on the two soldiers locked in their silent communion. When Thomas finally began to lower his hand, Captain Mitchell did the same, maintaining the synchronized precision that had marked their entire interaction. As their salutes concluded, Captain Mitchell took one step backward, creating space but maintaining eye contact with the young guard. "You honor your uniform and your country," Captain Mitchell said quietly, his words barely audible to the crowd, but clearly heard by Thomas. "Never doubt the value of your service." Thomas nodded almost imperceptibly, the only response he could make while maintaining his ceremonial position. But his eyes conveyed everything that words could not express: gratitude, recognition, and a renewed sense of purpose that would carry him through whatever challenges lay ahead. Captain Mitchell remained at attention for another moment, then executed a perfect military about-face and began walking back toward the ceremonial platform. The crowd parted before him like water, many people reaching out to touch his arm or shoulder as he passed, wanting to be part of the moment they had just witnessed. But the real transformation was happening within Thomas. Standing at his post, still fighting back tears, he felt fundamentally changed by the encounter. The isolation and questioning that had been building over months of ceremonial duty had been replaced by a powerful sense of connection and purpose. For the first time since taking his position as a royal guard, Thomas understood viscerally what his father had tried to tell him: that service takes many forms, and each form has its own dignity and importance. He did not need to be in combat to be a real soldier. He did not need to face enemy fire to serve his country with honor. A small child in the crowd, perhaps 6 years old, tugged on her mother's dress and pointed at Thomas. "Mommy, why is the soldier crying?" she asked in a voice loud enough for nearby adults to hear. Her mother knelt down and spoke softly, but clearly, because someone finally told him thank you for the hard work he does every day. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they feel really happy and grateful. The child nodded solemnly, and then, in a gesture that surprised her mother, raised her tiny hand in an approximation of a salute toward Thomas. Several other children in the crowd noticed and began copying the gesture, their innocent tribute adding another layer of emotion to an already overwhelming scene. As Captain Mitchell reached the ceremonial platform, planned Memorial Day ceremony resumed, but the atmosphere had completely changed. What had been a formal, somewhat distant observance had become something deeply personal and meaningful. The speakers who followed seemed to understand that they were now addressing an audience that had just witnessed authentic military honor in action. The palace's head of protocol, Sferret Edmund Whitmore, was frantically trying to determine how to handle the situation. In 40 years of managing royal ceremonies, he had never encountered anything like this. His first instinct was to have Thomas quietly replaced during the next guard change to avoid further disruptions. But as he watched the crowd's reaction and felt the emotional weight of what had just occurred, he began to reconsider. Meanwhile, Thomas continued to stand at his post. But everything about his posture had changed. Where before he had maintained his position through discipline and training, now he stood with renewed purpose. His back was straighter, his gaze more focused, and there was an energy about him that had not been there before. The crowd could sense the change, and many lingered near his position instead of moving on to other attractions. A group of military veterans, who had been attending the ceremony, approached Thomas's post after the official proceedings concluded. Led by an elderly man wearing a Korean War veteran's cap, they formed a loose semicircle in front of the guard. Without speaking, the elderly veteran raised his hand in salute, and the others followed suit. For a full minute, these old soldiers honored the young guard, their gesture creating ripples of emotion throughout the remaining crowd. Thomas felt his eyes welling up again as he watched these veterans, men who had seen real combat, who had sacrificed youth and health for their country, showing him the same respect that Captain Mitchell had offered. The isolation he had felt for months was being replaced by a profound sense of belonging to something larger than himself. One of the veterans stepped slightly forward and spoke in a voice weathered by age but strong with conviction. "Son, we know what it's like to serve in ways that people don't always understand. What you're doing matters. Standing guard, maintaining traditions, representing your country with dignity, that's real service, and we want you to know that we see it and we appreciate it." The veteran's wife, standing behind him, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her husband connect with this young soldier. She remembered how important it had been to him when he returned from Korea to feel that his service was recognized and valued. Seeing him pass that recognition forward to another generation filled her with pride as the crowd gradually dispersed.
Ow.
Thomas noticed that many people were looking at him differently now. Instead of the casual glances or attempts at humor he was used to receiving, people were regarding him with respect and genuine interest. Some took photos, but they did so respectfully, as if documenting something important rather than capturing a novelty. Later that afternoon, during the guard change ceremony, something unprecedented happened, as Thomas prepared to be relieved. By the next shift, Sergeant Major William Brooks, the head of the ceremonial guard unit, appeared personally to oversee the transition. This was unusual. Typically, junior officer handled routine guard changes. Sergeant Major Brooks had served 30 years in the military, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, before taking his current position overseeing the palace's ceremonial duties. He was a man known for strict adherence to protocol and little tolerance for deviation from established procedures. Thomas expected to be reprimanded for his emotional display and his unauthorized return of Captain Mitchell's salute. Instead, Sergeant Major Brooks approached Thomas with something resembling respect in his eyes. "Private Anderson," he said in his characteristic gravelly voice, "I've been watching the news coverage of this morning's events. What happened out there today reminds me why we do what we do." Thomas was stunned. He had expected discipline, possibly even dismissal from the ceremonial unit. Instead, his commanding officer was acknowledging the significance of the morning's events. "Sir, I know I broke protocol by returning the salute," Thomas began, but Sergeant Major Brooks cut him off with a gesture. "Son, sometimes there are things more important than protocol. What that veteran did for you, and what you did in response. That's what military honor looks like. It's what service is about. People who saw it today will remember it for the rest of their lives." and some of them will understand military service better because of what they witnessed. The relief. Guard, Private Jennifer Martinez, watched this exchange with fascination. She had been struggling with her own questions about the value of ceremonial duty, wondering if she was wasting her military career standing motionless while real soldiers served in combat zones around the world. Sergeant Major Brooks seemed to sense her thoughts. Private Martinez, what happened here today is a reminder that there are many ways to serve your country. Every one of you who stands guard here represents something important. You represent the continuity of service, the dignity of sacrifice, and the honor of those who came before us. That's not ceremonial, that's sacred. As Thomas was officially relieved of his duty, he walked toward the guardhouse with a lightness in his step that had not been there in months. The questioning and doubt that had been weighing on him had been replaced by clarity and purpose. In the guardhouse, his fellow guards greeted him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Word of the morning's events had spread quickly through the unit, and Thomas found himself surrounded by colleagues eager to hear his perspective on what had happened. "What was it like?" asked Private David Chen, who would take the evening guard shift.
I mean, when he saluted you, what did you feel? Thomas thought for a moment before answering. It felt like he saw me. Really saw me. Not just the uniform.
Or the ceremony, but me as a soldier, someone who chose to serve. And when he thanked me, it was like all the questions I'd been having about whether this job matters just disappeared. The conversation continued as other guards shared their own experiences of doubt, and the moments when they had found renewed purpose in their service. What Captain Mitchell had done for Thomas was creating ripples throughout the entire ceremonial guard unit, reminding them all of the dignity and importance of their chosen service. By evening, video footage of Captain Mitchell's salute and Thomas's emotional response had spread across social media platforms worldwide. The clip, filmed by multiple witnesses from different angles, showed the entire exchange in vivid detail. The veteran's approach, his respectful salute, Thomas's struggle with emotion, their mutual recognition of shared service. News outlets picked up the story with headlines like "War Hero Honors Palace," "Guard and Emotional Tribute in Veterans," "Salute Brings Royal Guard to Tears." But the story was resonating far beyond typical news cycles. Military families, veterans organizations, and active service members were sharing the video with their own stories of recognition and service. Captain Mitchell, meanwhile, had returned to his hotel room, unaware of the media attention his gesture was receiving. He had acted on instinct, responding to something he recognized in the young guard's bearing and dedication. When his phone began ringing with interview requests from news organizations, he was genuinely surprised by the level of interest. His daughter Sarah, a nurse in Chicago, called him after seeing the video on her Facebook feed. "Dad, you're famous," she said, her voice filled with pride and emotion. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen you do, and I've watched you do a lot of beautiful things over the years." Captain Mitchell was uncomfortable with the attention, but he understood why the moment had struck such a chord with people. "The young man reminded me of soldiers I served with," he explained to Sarah. There was something about his dedication, his commitment to doing his job perfectly, even when nobody was paying attention, that deserved recognition. At the palace, Sir Edmund Whitmore was dealing with unprecedented media interest in the ceremonial guard program. Reporters wanted to interview Thomas. Photographers wanted to capture the guards in action. Television producers were proposing documentaries about the life of ceremonial soldiers. Initially, Whitmore's instinct was to decline all requests and maintain the traditional distance between the guards and the media. But as he read the overwhelmingly positive coverage and saw how the story was inspiring discussions about service and sacrifice, he began to reconsider. Thomas himself was struggling with the sudden attention. He had joined the ceremonial guard unit partly because he was not comfortable with public speaking or being the center of attention. The idea of giving interviews about his emotional reaction to Captain Mitchell's gesture felt overwhelming. But Sergeant Major Brooks had a different perspective. During a private meeting with Thomas, he explained how the young guard's response was affecting people far beyond the palace walls. "Son, I've been getting calls from military recruiters saying that enlistment inquiries have increased since your video went viral. Parents are telling their children about the importance of service, because they saw how moved you were by being recognized for yours. You've got veterans calling their own adult children to talk about what service means. What happened between you and Captain Mitchell is having an impact you never could have imagined." Thomas was amazed by this news. The idea that his emotional response to being honored could inspire others to consider military service had never occurred to him. He had been focused on his own struggles with the meaning and value of his position, not thinking about how his dedication might appear to others. "I still don't understand why people are so interested," Thomas admitted. "I just did what felt right in the moment." Sergeant Major Brooks smiled, remembering his own younger self in the moments when he had questioned whether his service mattered. "That's exactly why it resonates with people. You weren't performing or trying to create a moment. You were just being honest about what that recognition meant to you. People can tell the difference between something genuine and something staged." Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell had agreed to one television interview, hoping to shift attention from himself to the broader issues of military service and veteran support. During the interview, he spoke about the isolation that many veterans feel after returning from combat and the importance of recognizing service in all its forms. "That young guard represents something that we sometimes forget," Captain Mitchell explained to the interviewer. "Not all service happens on battlefields. Some service happens in the quiet dedication to duty, the commitment to representing your country with honor, even when nobody seems to notice." When I saw him standing there, I saw a soldier who deserved recognition. The interviewer asked about Thomas's emotional response, and Captain Mitchell's answer revealed the depth of his understanding. He cried because somebody finally acknowledged what he gives every day, standing perfectly still for hours, maintaining dignity under all conditions, representing something larger than yourself that takes its own kind of courage. I wanted him to know that his service is seen and valued. Back at the palace, Thomas was gradually becoming more comfortable with the attention. Letters began arriving from military families around the world, thanking him for his service and sharing their own stories of sacrifice and dedication. A particularly moving letter came from the widow of a soldier who had been killed in Afghanistan. "Watching you receive recognition for your service reminded me of all the times my husband stood guard duty in dangerous places," she wrote. "He would have been proud to see how you honored your position and how gracefully you accepted the respect you were shown. Thank you for reminding us that service comes in many forms." These letters helped Thomas understand that his role as a ceremonial guard was more significant than he had realized. He was not just standing at a post, he was representing the dedication and sacrifice of all service members, past and present. The palace administration made a decision that would have been unthinkable before the incident. They created a small display near the guard posts explaining the history and significance of the ceremonial guard program. The display included information about the training required, the selection process, and the role these guards played in honoring military tradition. Visitors began approaching the guard posts with greater respect and understanding. Instead of trying to make the guards laugh or treating them as tourist attractions, people would stand quietly and observe, occasionally offering small gestures of respect, like Captain Mitchell's salute had started. 3 months after the Memorial Day encounter, the palace hosted a special ceremony to honor all forms of military service. The event had been inspired directly by the viral moment between Captain Mitchell and Thomas, and both men had been invited. As honored guests, Thomas stood at his usual post, but this time the crowd gathering around him was different. Instead of casual tourists taking selfies, the audience consisted of military families, veterans, and people who had been moved by the story of recognition and respect that had begun at this very spot. Captain Mitchell arrived early, walking slowly through the courtyard with the same careful steps that had first brought him to Thomas's attention, but now he was accompanied by his daughter Sarah and his grandson Michael, a 16-year-old who had been inspired by his grandfather's story to consider military service after high school. "Is that him, Grandpa?" Michael asked, pointing toward Thomas at the guard post. "The one you saluted?" Captain Mitchell nodded, studying the young guard with the same attention he had paid 3 months earlier. Thomas looked different now, more confident, more settled in his role. The questioning and doubt that had been visible in his posture before had been replaced by quiet certainty about the value of what he was doing. The ceremony began with speeches from military leaders and government officials. But the real highlight came when Captain Mitchell was invited to speak about the importance of recognizing service in all its forms. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience that included dozens of ceremonial guards from various military units, Captain Mitchell spoke from his heart about the moment that had changed both his life and Thomas's. 3 months ago, I walked over to that young man because I saw something in him that reminded me of soldiers I had served with in combat, he began. I saw dedication, discipline, and a commitment to something larger than himself. I wanted him to know that those qualities were recognized and valued. He paused, looking directly at Thomas, who remained at attention, but whose eyes showed he was listening to every word. What I did not expect was how much that moment would teach me about the power of recognition. Private Anderson's response reminded me that every person in uniform, regardless of their specific role, deserves acknowledgement for their service. His tears were not a sign of weakness. They were a sign of how deeply he cares about serving his country with honor. The crowd applauded, but Captain Mitchell was not finished. Since that day, I have received hundreds of messages from military families telling me that the video of our exchange helped them talk to their children about service, helped veterans feel seen and appreciated, and helped active duty members remember why they chose to serve. What started as a simple gesture of respect between two soldiers has become something much larger. When Captain Mitchell finished speaking, he did something that surprised everyone, including the ceremony organizers. Instead of returning to his seat, he walked directly to Thomas's guard post, just as he had 3 months earlier. This time, however, he was not alone. His grandson Michael walked beside him, along with dozens of other people from the audience. Veterans, military spouses, children of service members, and civilians who simply wanted to show their respect. One by one, they approached Thomas and offered their own salutes, handshakes, or simple words of thanks. The line stretched across the courtyard as people waited their turn to honor the young guard who had become a symbol of unrecognized service everywhere. Thomas, still maintaining his ceremonial position, was overwhelmed by the outpouring of respect and gratitude. Each person who approached him represented a story of service, sacrifice, or appreciation that had been touched by his emotional response to Captain Mitchell's original gesture. A young girl, no more than 8 years old, approached, with her father, a Navy officer still on active duty. She had drawn a picture of a soldier standing guard, with the words, "Thank you for protecting us," written in crayon across the top. "Can I give this to him?" she asked her father in a whisper loud enough for Thomas to hear. Her father nodded and helped her approach Thomas's position. "Thank you for your service," she said solemnly, holding up the drawing so Thomas could see it clearly. For the second time in 3 months, Thomas felt tears forming in his eyes. But this time they were not tears of surprise or emotional release. They were tears of gratitude for being part of something that had grown far beyond his individual service too. Become a movement of recognition and respect, the ceremony concluded, with the announcement of a new tradition. Every Memorial Day, the palace would host a special recognition ceremony for all forms of military service, with ceremonial guards playing a prominent role in honoring the sacrifice and dedication of their fellow service members. As the crowd dispersed, Captain Mitchell approached Thomas one final time. The two men looked at each other with the understanding that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. "How do you feel about all this attention?" Captain Mitchell asked quietly. Thomas smiled. The first time anyone had seen him break his ceremonial composure during duty hours. "I feel like I finally understand what my father meant when he told me that the most important service often goes unnoticed," he replied. "Except now I know that it doesn't have to go unrecognized forever. Sometimes it just takes one person who truly understands to change everything." Captain Mitchell nodded, remembering his own moments of doubt during his military career. Times when he had wondered if his sacrifices mattered to anyone beyond his immediate unit. That recognition you felt that day, that's what every veteran hopes for. The knowledge that their service meant something to someone. As Captain Mitchell prepared to leave, Thomas made a decision that would surprise everyone who knew him. Breaking protocol for the second time in his career, he stepped slightly forward from his post and extended his hand to the veteran. "Sir," Thomas said quietly, "I want you to know that what you did for me that day changed not just how I see my service, but how hundreds of other guards see theirs. You gave us back our pride. Captain Mitchell shook Thomas's hand firmly, understanding that this simple gesture represented the completion of a circle that had begun with a salute 3 months earlier. Over the following year, the story of the encounter would continue to inspire changes in how ceremonial military positions were viewed and valued. Military academies began using the video in their leadership courses as an example of how small acts of recognition can have profound impacts. Veterans organizations adopted Recognition Day events where they specifically honored service members. In ceremonial and support roles, Thomas was promoted to corporal and eventually became an instructor for new ceremonial guards, teaching them not just the technical aspects of their duties but the deeper meaning behind their service. He would often tell new recruits about the day a war hero's salute reminded him that all honorable service, no matter how quiet or seemingly routine, contributes to something greater than any individual. Captain Mitchell returned to his home state, where he began speaking at veterans events and military ceremonies about the importance of recognizing all forms of service. He established a foundation that provided support and recognition for military personnel in ceremonial and support roles, ensuring that others would receive the acknowledgement that had meant so much to Thomas. The bench where Captain Mitchell had sat before approaching Thomas that Memorial Day morning was dedicated with a small plaque that read, "In honor of all who serve, those who fight in distant lands and those who stand guard at home. Every act of service matters." Years later, when Thomas had completed his military service and moved on to civilian life, he would often return to the palace on Memorial Day. He would stand among the crowd, watching the new generation of guards perform their duties with the same dedication he had once shown, and sometimes, when he saw a veteran in the crowd looking at the guards with understanding and respect, Thomas would approach them and share the story of how one moment of recognition had changed everything, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed the power of one soldier honoring another. The viral video of their encounter was eventually archived in the National Military History Museum with the caption, "A reminder that recognition and respect know no boundaries of rank, branch, or battlefield." Sometimes the most powerful salutes are exchanged not between generals, but between warriors who simply recognize the service in each other's hearts. Thomas kept the little girl's crayon drawing in his personal effects long after he left military service, a reminder that the impact of their story had reached even the youngest members of society, teaching children about respect, service, and the importance of saying thank you to those who dedicate their lives to serving others. The moment that had begun with tears of surprise and recognition had grown into a legacy of understanding that would influence military culture for generations to come, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures of respect can create the most lasting changes in how we honor those who serve.